Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and I got wood.
Yes, real mature way to start the video, Herbert.
I'm going to use those tools you see to turn that wood into a pair of baseboards for my model railway. Before I start, I should say that I barely know what I'm doing. I have done little bits of woodworking here and there, but I'm not a carpenter, and I'm about the last person you should be taking woodworking advice from. Also, there are all kinds of ways to make a baseboard using many different kinds of materials. I'm just showing you what I did, rather than saying something like, this is the way you should be making your baseboards too. There's a lot of ways this can be done, and most of them are pretty valid. Okay, let's get started before I waffle any further. The first thing I learned is that while I've bought 2 pieces of 7mm thick plywood that say that they're 897mm by 1200mm, that isn't what I got. Measuring the wood, I find I've got 900 by 1208. It's not really a bad thing. It's not like I've been sold less than what I've paid for, and on seeing this, I did recall that I had heard somewhere that you don't get precise lengths of wood from the hardware. Unsurprisingly, the pieces of pine were also just a little bit longer than the 1200 and 1800mm they're meant to be. They are, fortunately, the correct dimensions otherwise, being 64mm by 19mm. The slightly larger than expected plywood isn't really an issue, but it did lead me to my first mistake. I'd sketched out a basic idea of what I wanted, and noted down the lengths at which to cut the wood. These measurements were based on the assumption that the plywood tops were 1200 by 897. Initially, I was going to use the 1200mm lengths of pine along the 1200mm edge of the plywood. Makes sense, right? I abandoned that idea, because obviously it wasn't going to work, but for whatever reason, I still measured my first cuts based on a 1200mm long edge, so they were a bit short. I am not a smart man. Clearly they weren't going to fit, but not all was lost. I put the 2 shorter parts aside for later. They'd still be long enough to make the middle bracing parts. It didn't take me too long to realise my mistake, fortunately, so I reconfigured my measurements. I also double-checked to make sure that I wasn't making some other mistake. I didn't want to have to buy more wood. The more astute amongst you might notice that I'm using a square to mark my lines. It seemed like this would be a good way to get nice straight lines, and hopefully neat straight cuts. When I started planning for a model railway, I was initially thinking of getting a power saw that would clamp the wood and get a very straight cut. But I came to my senses and realised I'd be paying a big chunk of money for a tool that I'd probably never use again, so instead I bought a $10 tenon saw. Much cheaper, and I did manage to get some pretty straight and fairly neat cuts with it. I mean, there are some cuts with little chunks out of the corner or whatever, but don't worry about those. With the pieces of wood cut to the correct size for the outside of the frame, it's time to do some screwing.
Oh, you're so funny, Herbert.
I figured it was a good idea to countersink the holes for the screws, though I'm not sure I had the correct kind of countersink bit. It seemed to be struggling a little, and it did take a while to get these holes done. Not a ridiculous amount of time, but I thought it would be quicker. Like I said, I don't know what I'm doing. At any rate, I got it done, and the pieces are ready to be screwed together. When I was at the hardware looking at clamps, I spotted this thing. I believe it's called a mitre clamp, and I figured it would help me get the pieces screwed together at a nice 90-degree angle. And it does. The way it's used is probably obvious. It's nice and simple, and it pretty much eliminates the need for me to hold the pieces together perfectly, which is great when you've only got one drill and you need to swap the bit between the drill bit and the screwdriver bit. This way, the parts won't move, or at least they shouldn't move. Of course, there's going to be some hero down in the comments who says something like,
"Oh, I never use anything like that."
Nobody cares. I think it's a pretty useful tool, and I'm pretty sure I would have done a worse job without it. The way I do the screwing is probably pretty obvious. First, I drill a pilot hole, and maybe that's not totally necessary, but I know from previous woodworking attempts that not doing this can cause the wood to split, which is not really ideal. Unsurprisingly, the screws come next. Having no real idea which screws would be suitable, and being a bit overwhelmed by the vast array of screws in the hardware, I went with some black ones. That's metal, that's grim, though they are timber screws, or as my American friends might call it, lumber screws. I've no idea if the black is some sort of fancy coating, or if it's just to look cool. Either way, these are 5mm by 40mm, so there's going to be roughly equal amounts of screw in each piece of wood. That should hold things pretty good, I assume. I put 2 screws in each corner, which seems adequate, and I think I got a reasonable result. It's not perfect, not even close, but it should be adequate. I didn't measure, but the corners do look to be pretty neat and square. Unfortunately, the wood isn't perfect, and while I did my best to select the straightest pieces, some of them do have a very slight bend in them. I figured the central bracing bits, whatever you might want to call them, would help to correct some of that. So, back to measuring, and making sure the measurements were close enough. And then some more cutting, and I'm pretty glad I chose to buy the cheap tenon saw. It's way cheaper, and this wood is fairly small, so cutting it barely takes any time or effort. You've just got to make sure that you're cutting as straight as you can. Next, I install these bits in the middle. The one I'm installing here will be at the outer end, that is, the ends that won't be joining together in the middle, and I did put some thought into where this piece should go. Unless I've done this wrong, and there's every chance I could have, when I lay the tracks, there shouldn't be any points above this. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to use point motors. I may use them on what I'm considering to be the far side of the layout, just so that I don't have to walk around because I'm lazy. And at this point, if I do use point motors, I'm not sure if I'm going to mount them above or below the board. But the idea here was that I would avoid future headaches if I do choose to mount point motors under the board. It's probably a good thing to be considering at this stage. Installing this is pretty much the same as the outer parts. I countersink, then I drill pilot holes, and then, you guessed it, screws. There's another pair of bracing parts, battens, bracing parts, middle bits, whatever they might be called. I chose to put these in lengthways rather than the same direction as the first bit. I feel like this should avoid any point motors I might install. It may also be a space for any future legs to fold up into. At this point, I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Anyway, here's what I ended up with. I think I've done a pretty decent job, especially considering my lack of skill and experience with this kind of thing. The first one of these I made was better than the second one somehow, and I don't know how I did it, but the middle bracing bits in the second one are comically different to the first. What matters is that the outer parts of the frame are relatively straight and neat. I'm sure it's probably obvious to a lot of people, but what I thought was a good idea was to place the frame onto the plywood top as neatly as I could, and then trace around the inside. This should help me get the screws into the right place when attaching the plywood, which is the logical next step. Now, you would imagine this is pretty simple, just plop the plywood on top of the frame and screw it down, and in a perfect world, it would be that simple, and maybe it does happen that way for people who are good at woodwork, but it won't be happening for me. I line the plywood up as neatly as I can at one end, the end that'll go against the other board. That is the one that needs to be neatest after all, and you can see it doesn't automatically line up anywhere near close to perfect at the other end, but that's okay. At the good end, I countersink and make sure everything is still lined up as best I can get it, and then I drill a pilot hole. How a hole can fly a plane I don't know, but it is still a pilot.
Oh yes, you're so funny, Herbert.
Then, obviously, I add a screw. For this I'm using these. As with the other screws, I've no idea if these are the best choice. I figured I probably don't need 40mm long screws for this. I start with one screw, and then I check the other corner at the same end to make sure it's still as neat as I can get it. Starting with one screw in one corner means that you should be able to make adjustments, at least until you put the second screw in. The other end is still bad, but now that the good end is secured, it shouldn't be too hard to deal with. Instead of just screwing it into place where it sits, I apply some pressure to pull the frame in under the plywood. It's obviously not going to stay there of its own volition, after all it's wood and doesn't have volition. So, I use the power of clamp. I follow this with what you might expect me to follow it with, drilling and screwing. It's still not quite perfect though. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but there is another fixable flaw. The frame still protrudes from the side a little bit, and the way to deal with it is the same as before. It just needed a little bit more pressure and a second clamp to be sure that it would stay there. Leaning over the work with the drill like this is probably not really ideal, but it did work. Now all that's left to do is add some more screws so the plywood doesn't lift up off the frame anywhere. I use the lines I traced around the frame as a guide in the middle. It may not be perfectly accurate, especially if your support parts are as wonky as some of mine, but it's better than having no guide or taking the time to make accurate measurements from below. I countersink and then drill the holes. You can kind of tell by feel if the drill is going into the frame or not, but you can always lift the board up and check underneath if you're not sure. And if you miss the frame, just make another hole. It's all going to be covered up anyway, so a couple of extra holes probably won't hurt anything. Drive the screws in, and that's it. Initially I didn't put that many screws in, and it probably would have been fine, but I decided to add more. It's not like it took that much extra effort, and it made me feel more confident that this would stay together. So that's it. Now I have 2 baseboards. The next step is to add the bits that will hold them together. Will the ends go together neatly without too much of a gap? Find out in the next episode of Herbert's Model Railway, or whatever we're calling this. I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. Of course, I've made mistakes, and they're not perfect, and it took me a lot longer to build them than I thought it would, but that's not really a problem. I did go at my own pace, which probably helped avoid some mistakes. I think if I tried this a few more times, I would be able to do them much nicer and quicker, but that would be a bit wasteful. And really, these are going to work perfectly fine. Its function is to hold a model railway and not show off my woodworking skills. I think this demonstrates that anybody can do this kind of thing. So if you want to build a model railway and building baseboards is holding you back, I'd like to encourage you to give it a go. You'll probably surprise yourself. For me, this was the biggest hurdle to starting my model railway, and I'm glad it's out of the way. Pretty much everything else can slowly be worked on as I have time and I feel like it, or more realistically, as I've got the money for it. As I said at the start of the video, I'm not a woodworker, nor am I going to pretend that this is the only way to do this. There's about as many different ways to make a baseboard as there is baseboards. All I've really done is use all of the videos and articles and stuff I've seen over the years on this subject and do my own interpretation of it to suit my needs. And the main things for me are that it's going to be light enough to move around, being that I haven't got anywhere to set it up permanently, and that it fits in my car. I'm sure one of those guys that insists on using massive pieces of wood for baseboards is going to piss and moan about it, but it doesn't need to support the weight of a real train because they're tiny plastic models. It's not that heavy. This is going to work fine. I'm probably waffling now. I'm pretty excited to start laying the track. I don't actually have any track yet, so it's going to be a while, but I am excited. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. That's what it's for. And if you've not already done so, why not subscribe here on YouTube for the low price of absolutely nothing? Or if you have the means and you want to help a Herbert Erpaderp do Herbert Erpaderp things, like maybe getting some track laid sooner, as well as see my videos a bit early, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to Patreon and all of my other things like Discord and social media in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, have an amazing day, and thanks for watching. Farewell.